Hello everyone, and welcome to the September Model Aquatic Health Code Network webinar titled Cyanuric Acid and the Fecal, Vomit, and Blood Response, with featured speaker Michele Hlavsa of the CDC's Healthy Swimming Program. Before we begin, there are just a few logistics to go over. Webinar audio will be provided through your computer speakers. There's no need to dial into any conference line. Please submit any questions and comments via the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. The Q&A portion of today's webinar will take place after our featured webinar, but feel free to submit any questions or comments through the duration of the webinar. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all participants. It can also be viewed on the NACCHO MAC Network webpage. So, a few updates from NACCHO, first of all. Our next webinar will be held in November. The topic is tentatively set to be acoustics with indoor swimming pools. Additionally, we have a link here to take NEHA's Assessing Recreational Water Health, and links as needed are to the Model Aquatic Health Code webpage, where you can find all of our archived webinars and resources, and you can also sign up to receive emails from the MAC network. Unless there are any questions, we can answer them at the end as well. So moving on, we are going to have a few updates from Doug Sackett, who is the Executive Director of the Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code. So whenever you're ready, Doug,
okay.
Go ahead.
So will you be advancing the slides for me then?
Yes, we have control of the slides and we can move them.
Okay. Guys, everybody, got some technical difficulties on this end, so I can't see the webinar, and I'm kind of going blind here, so I apologize in advance. So if we go to the slide number 2 about the MAC, the update process, where we're at, is we have finalized 178 change requests for member vote. The technical review committee evaluation reports have all been completed, and they're posted on the website, so you can view not only change requests, but the reports, TRC reports, along with the associated any technical support committee reports. And those change requests and the TRC evaluation reports are available on the website. You can see the web address listed. It's basically on the home page, the burgundy button at the top right. If you hover over that, you'll see View Change Requests. If you click on that, you'll have access to those CRs and the evaluation reports. Next slide. Just an update on our vote on the code conference, again, which is scheduled October 17th and 18th in Denver, just preceding the World Aquatic Health Conference at the Omni Interlaken Hotel. The registration for our conference is open on April 3rd and remains open. One item update of note is that the live stream now is available for free for members only, though. You still must register, though. To go to the Code Conference registration page on our website, you'll click live stream only, and it'll show free. But we do need you to register because there will be some access codes and the likes that will be needed to be provided so that you can access the live stream during the conference. We do continue to encourage public health members of CMAC to take part in the update process so that your voices can be heard and your input heard by CDC. So again, we think attendance in person is very beneficial because it allows you the opportunity to network with your fellow CMAC public health members. And there's some caucus discussions, several of them throughout the conference, where the different sectors have the opportunity to meet separately to discuss the change requests that had previously been discussed in the preceding hours before the caucus, and then you can have some discussions, maybe discussions on what the group, like a public health group vote would likely be. Again, the conference, you'll have the opportunity to discuss all change requests, member comments, and technical review committee recommendations. And we're going to have CMAC an update on CMAC business also. So again, I think there's great benefit to attending in person, but if you can't, remember the live stream is free. Next slide is just my contact information. If you have questions, need to get in touch with me, here's my contact information. And the closing slide is the website information for CDC's MAC Healthy Swimming website and CMAC's website. And that is the end of my update process for CMAC. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. So without further ado, we're going to move on to our feature presentation from Michele Hlavsa. Michele is chief of the CDC's Healthy Swimming Program and the Domestic Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene Team in the National Center for Emerging Zoonotic and Infectious Diseases. Prior to joining the program, Michele was an Epidemic Intelligence Service Officer, and has worked on a number of outbreak investigations of waterborne and foodborne disease. She received a BS in nursing from the College of New Jersey and an MPH from Emory University. Michele's areas of expertise include the transmission of pathogens that cause recreational water illness, in particular cryptosporidium, and development of appropriate preventive and control measures. And she also collaborates with state and local health authorities and the private sector on RWI prevention efforts. Thank you for being here today, Michele, and feel free to begin whenever you're ready.
Well, thanks for having me. I think the image here with the kid holding his ears is kind of how a lot of pool operators and some of us in public health feel when there is a fecal vomit or blood contamination event, and especially when cyanuric acid is involved. But the MAC really walks us through on how to deal with it. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about how the current version of the MAC, the 2016 second edition, addresses these issues and the science behind these recommendations. So just a quick disclaimer, just a common CDC disclaimer. Swimming is fun. It's a great way to spend time with family and friends. The point of this talk is not to make sure no one ever swims again, but rather, try to get the benefits of physical activity, the benefits of having fun with friends and family, and decrease the risk associated with water-based physical activity, with getting into the pool. It's all about managing risk for all the stakeholders, whether it's the aquatic sector, public health, swimmers, or parents of young swimmers. Let's minimize the risk and maximize the health benefits, and whether they're mental health or physical health benefits. So quickly, an outline of this talk is I'll be discussing the disinfection of chlorine-intolerant infectious pathogens, which is most pathogens, and extremely chlorine-tolerant cryptosporidium. And I'll close this presentation up with a quick discussion of pool chemical safety. So this histogram here looks at outbreaks associated with recreational water that have been reported to CDC since 1978, when reporting began, through 2012, the last year for which we have published data. We are currently working on 2013 and 14 data and hope to have those out later this year. What we did in this histogram, we divided the outbreaks by the type of illness. So the orange bars represent outbreaks of acute gastrointestinal illness. The purple bars, outbreaks associated with skin. The yellow bars represent outbreaks of acute respiratory illness, and the blue bars represent the remaining outbreaks. And you see overall, in the late 90s and into the 2000s, there's definitely been an increase in the number of outbreaks reported to CDC each year. This graph or histogram looks specifically at the gastrointestinal outbreaks. And you see, again, that increase in the late 1990s and in the 2000s, that big jump in 2007. And it's the gastrointestinal illness outbreaks that are really driving the overall shape of the histograms of the outbreaks. So the big issue that we're dealing with is acute gastrointestinal illness when it comes to outbreaks associated with recreational water. And when we focus specifically on acute gastrointestinal outbreaks associated with treated recreational water, the ones for the last 10 years, a lot of the story is cryptosporidium, but I want to start with the other 20%, the outbreaks caused by chlorine-sensitive pathogens or susceptible pathogens, your Giardia, your norovirus, your E. coli, your Shigella. These are the outbreaks that shouldn't be happening. We have standards in place that these outbreaks should be easily prevented by maintaining good chlorine levels, good pH, etc. Okay, so we're going to be talking about cyanuric acid, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So cyanuric acid comes in one of two ways, as a standalone product, CYA or isocyanuric acid, or as a product combined with chlorine, so dichlor or sodium dichloroisocyanuric acid, or trichloro isocyanuric acid. And basically what we're doing when we're adding cyanuric acid to the water, we're trying to protect the chlorine that's killing the infectious pathogens. We're trying to prevent it from being degraded or depleted by the sun's ultraviolet light. So this is done by having the chlorine bind to the molecule of the cyanuric acid. The second image, or the middle image on this slide, depicts dichlor. The bottom image depicts trichlor. So the thing to keep in mind is, the chlorine is somewhat bound to this cyanuric acid molecule. That's how you protect it from the degradation and the depletion. But at the same time, you're not making that chlorine free so that it can inactivate or kill bacteria, parasites, viruses, or algae as effectively as it would without the cyanuric acid being present. So that means we're basically going to be increasing the contact time, or CT inactivation values. So what exactly do I mean by this? And I'm going to cover this from the perspective of Staphylococcus, a typical bacteria we find on our skin. In this table here, we look at the first column, the concentration of cyanuric acid. The second column is the CT inactivation value. The third column is the inactivation time in minutes. If you look at the formula below the table, you can see that the CT inactivation value, the middle column, is actually the product, or simple math, multiplying the concentration of the disinfectant times the inactivation time. So we're taking milligrams per liter and multiplying that by minutes. If my contact inactivation value remains steady, then I can play with where I'm going to be concentrating my disinfectant or how much time I spend. So if my concentration increases, I can decrease my inactivation time and vice versa. So if we look at the first row of the table, we see the cyanuric acid concentration at 0. We see a CT inactivation value of 0.5, and we see an inactivation time of 1. And we get that because what we're doing here basically is looking at a 3 log, if we look at the footnote, a 3 log, a 99.9% inactivation value, and our chlorine is at 0.5. So if we take 0.5 CT inactivation value and divide it by 0.5 concentration for chlorine, we get a value of 1, or 1 minute for disinfection. If we go to the last row and we increase the CYA concentration to 100, our CT inactivation value increases to 6.3. If we divide that 6.3 by the 0.5 milligrams per liter free chlorine, we're up to 13 minutes. So not only does CYA increase your CT inactivation value, the more of it you have, the longer it's going to take to disinfect your infectious pathogens. So what does the MAC say about cyanuric acid? Well, first, it says that cyanuric acid concentration needs to be maintained at 90 ppm or less, or milligrams per liter. And it recommends not using cyanuric acid in newly constructed or substantially altered hot tub spas and therapy pools. In terms of disinfection and pH control, what does the MAC say? So chlorine, the minimum chlorine for our treated aquatic venues that are not using cyanuric acid is 1 part per million. In terms of aquatic venues that use cyanuric acid, we're saying 2 parts per million. So we're trying again to compensate for the slow disinfection rate. The exceptions to this rule are hot tub spa, where the minimum recommended chlorine concentration, or free available chlorine, is 3.0 ppm. Overall, the maximum chlorine concentration is recommended to be no more than 10 parts per million at any time that bathers are in the venue. When we talk about bromine, we're talking about 3 parts per million for aquatic venues minimum, with the exception of hot tub spas, 4 parts per million, the maximum being 8 parts per million when they're bathers in the water. The pH is to be maintained at 7.2 to 7.8, and as you all know, that's to maintain, maximize the efficacy of the chlorine while making sure bathers are comfortable in the water and the equipment isn't getting corroded. Other disinfectants that the MAC addresses include compressed chlorine gas. You see the recommendations in the MAC really focus and prioritize safety. The MAC also addresses to some extent salt, electrolytic chlorine generators, brine electrolytic chlorine, or bromine generators. The MAC also talks about copper-silver ions, and it recommends a concentration of no more than 1.3 ppm of copper and 0.1 ppm silver. If using copper and silver, the MAC recommends not modifying the recommended chlorine and bromine concentrations that we discussed in the previous slide. The MAC is open to using other disinfectants as long as they're EPA approved and meet other criteria such as not interfering with water quality measurements. So potentially in the future we might be looking at something such as chlorine dioxide, but again we would have to be prioritizing safety, much like we do with compressed chlorine gas now. So when we talk about formed fecal incidents in pools or formed fecal incident contamination events, we're really talking about Giardia, and this is based on a study that CDC did back in 1999 looking at formed stools from fecal incidents in our treated aquatic venues. Basically, in the summer of 1999, during that swim season, CDC worked with 47 aquatic venues or facilities across the United States and collected some 293 formed stool incidents. So we here at CDC found that 13 or 4.4% of those formed stools tested positive for Giardia, and none of them tested positive for Cryptosporidium. Data from the EPA indicate that to achieve a 3-log or 99.9% cystin activation for Giardia, when the water pH is at 7.5 or less, or the temperature is at 25 degrees Celsius or more, we're looking at 1 part per million free chlorine in 45 minutes, 2 parts per million free chlorine 25 minutes, or 3 parts per million 19 minutes. And given that, we're dealing with Giardia or suspect we might be dealing with Giardia, it just follows that our formed fecal incident response recommendations in the MAC and for CDC in general, are based on this 2 part per million and 25 minutes or so. So this slide here talks about what the MAC recommends if there is a formed fecal incident in the pool, if there's a vomit contamination event, or even a blood contamination event. In terms of vomit, oftentimes we're not so much worried about transmitting infectious pathogens. Oftentimes it's about swallowing water and young children vomiting that water to get it out of their system. However, there is some risk of norovirus. Norovirus, however, is considered less intolerant to chlorine than Giardia. And in terms of blood contamination events, whether or not the operator chooses to close down the pool is, I'm saying it's a choice because it's not really an issue of transmitting pathogens. It's more of an issue of possibly aesthetics for patrons, and they need to see the facility operator responding to, a blood contamination event. So regardless of what kind of contamination event we're talking about, minus the diarrheal stools, we're going to focus here on formed fecal incidents, vomit contamination, or blood contamination. We're going to close immediately the aquatic venue that's been contaminated. We're also going to close down any aquatic venue sharing the recirculation system. Then we're going to focus on removing the contaminated material and disposing of it. And when we're doing that, we're not using the vacuum cleaner because there's no real way to disinfect and clean it. And when we take this item to clean the pool, we're going to clean that item and we're going to immerse it into the venue, so we're going to disinfect it while we're disinfecting the water. The MAC recommends raising the chlorine level at that point to 2 parts per million if it's not already there, and doing so for 25 minutes while maintaining a pH of 7.5 or less and a temperature of 25 degrees Celsius or more. And while this is all going on, the operator should be testing the chlorine and the pH at multiple sampling points to make sure that they are where they need to be, and not using stabilized chlorine. So we're going to try to stay away from the cyanuric acid, the dichlor, and the trichlor to prevent slowing down of disinfection rate. If there is CYA already in the water, because that's the way the pool is operated, then you want to double the inactivation time. and so that's going up to 50 minutes or more. Since we're on, decontamination, I quickly want to touch on surface decontamination. So if there is a body fluid spill involving feces, vomit, or blood, the first thing the facility wants to do is to limit access to the area that's contaminated. Then the aquatic staff needs to clean and remove all visible contaminant with disposable cleaning products before using the disinfectant. And the thinking here is to get rid of the disinfectant, to get rid of the contamination, because it will potentially protect the pathogens from disinfection. Then the next step is to dispose of the contaminant in a sanitary manner or as required by the state and local jurisdiction, and then follow up by disinfecting the contaminated surfaces, either using 1-to-10 dilution of fresh household bleach with water, or the equivalent U.S. EPA registered disinfectant approved for bodily fluids. The next step is to soak the affected area for a minimum of 20 minutes, or as directed by the disinfectant label, and then removing the disinfectant by cleaning and disposing of it in a sanitary manner or as required by the state or local jurisdiction. So I want to go back to this histogram and really focus on these outbreaks these outbreaks of acute gastrointestinal illness. As I said before, late 1990s, 2000s, we see this increase in the number of outbreaks reported each year to CDC. I do want to take a minute here to focus on 2007, and that was a year Utah had a huge statewide outbreak. We think part of the reason why 2007 stands out so much is because there's a possibility that we counted a multi-state outbreak as multiple outbreaks. So it wasn't only Utah having an outbreak, but a lot of the adjacent states reported cryptosporidiosis outbreaks that summer. And, I guess this is my opportunity to do a plug for CryptoNet. When outbreak investigations are being done, CryptoNet offers us an opportunity to look at the DNA or do molecular characterization of crypto and see what's circulating. It would have been nice to, at that point, been able to look at the crypto in Utah and in the surrounding states to see what was going on. But I strongly encourage you, when doing outbreak investigations, to consider, contacting CDC and your lab colleagues and working on, getting crypto isolates molecularly characterized, and in doing so not only during outbreak situations, but even year-round, to look what's normally circulating so you can interpret your outbreak data better. This graph here is basically the same as the one on the previous slide, but this breaks down the outbreaks in terms of whether the outbreak was associated with treated water or chlorinated or brominated water, like our pools, our water play venues or water playgrounds, and our untreated waters such as our lakes. The treated recreational water-associated outbreaks are depicted with the blue bars. The yellow ones are the untreated recreational water-associated outbreaks. The yellow bars are pretty stable over time. The blue bars, however, are increasing over time. And again, in the late 90s and into the 2000s. And as we looked at this pie chart before, the big push here, or the big driver here, is cryptosporidium, which is responsible for 80% of the outbreaks of acute gastrointestinal illness in the last 10 years for which we have data. And it's not about the operation and maintenance so much necessarily anymore when we're talking crypto outbreaks, as it is with the Giardia, the norovirus, et cetera. So what does the MAC have to say about all this? So we need to step up our game when it comes to dealing with crypto, and we need to go beyond the chlorine and the bromine, and we need to focus on how are we going to get rid of the crypto once it gets into the water. Well, the MAC recommends that new constructions and substantially altered increased risk venues use secondary disinfection systems. When we talk about increased venues, we're talking about venues that are increased risk for microbial contamination. Those, for example, designed for children less than 5 years of age. The children who don't necessarily have the best hygiene skills. They're still learning them, so things are rinsing off their bodies, and they don't have the best toileting skills, so things are being released from their bodies and into the water. It's also about increased risk venues being about people who are more susceptible to infection and trying to protect them. For example, maybe therapy pools where there are patients going into the pools with open wounds, which offer a portal of entry for infectious pathogens. Now, what do we mean by secondary versus supplemental disinfection systems? Well, basically, the secondary disinfection systems, we're looking at having to achieve 3 log or 99.9% inactivation of Cryptosporidium oocysts, where that recommendation is nice to have, but isn't applicable to the supplemental disinfection in terms of it's not as required. When we're talking about secondary and supplemental disinfection systems, right now at this time, we're talking basically about ultraviolet light and ozone. That's not to say we won't have other disinfection systems like this in the future, but this is where we are now. And right now, as it stands, because ultraviolet light, for example, doesn't provide residual disinfection in the water, you're getting your disinfection when the water passes the ultraviolet light. The use of ultraviolet light and ozone basically does not mean you can lower the required concentration for chlorine or bromine or change your parameters for pH. You basically have to stay as if the pool did not have a secondary or supplemental disinfection system. So when we think of diarrheal contamination events, we are thinking a high-risk Cryptosporidium contamination event. So we're now talking about, the parasite being in the water. We're talking about, this chlorine-intolerant parasite. That's why we're seeing so many outbreaks in pools associated with Cryptosporidium. So if there is a diarrheal event, we're going to treat it as potentially contamination of crypto, and we're basically, in the beginning, going to follow the same steps. We're going to close the pool immediately to bathers. We're going to close any other venue sharing a recirculation system. We're going to remove the contaminating material and dispose of it, not using a vacuum cleaner, and cleaning the item used to remove the contamination by immersing it in the water again. However, instead of with like a formed fecal incident contamination where we're going at 20 parts per million, or excuse me, at 2 parts per million for 25 or more minutes, we're now talking about 20 parts per million for almost 13 hours or the equivalent. Again, we're going to test the chlorine and pH at multiple sampling points, and we're not going to add the stabilized chlorine. Alternatively, to deal with these diarrheal contamination events, if there is a secondary disinfection system, you could circulate the water through that system and reduce the number of Cryptosporidium oocysts down to 1 oocyst per 100 mLs or milliliters, oocysts per milliliter, sorry. Okay, so what happens if we do have CYA in the water and we have a diarrheal event? Well, the science behind those recommendations comes from work that Jen Murphy has recently done and published. So here we're going to be looking at, in this table, at CYA concentrations of 16 ppm or less. The first column summarizes the average chlorine concentration. The second column looks at the average cyanuric acid. The first column is the chlorine concentration. The second column is the average cyanuric acid concentration. The third column is the average estimated CT or contact time inactivation value. And the last column is the average inactivation time. And I chose to display it here in hours. The formula for calculating is still minutes, but I put hours here just so it's easier to interpret the number. And again, when we're talking about the CT inactivation value, we're talking about 3 log inactivation time. We're talking about pH of about 7.6 and a temperature of about 25 degrees Celsius. So in the first row, we see we're maintaining our chlorine concentration roughly at 20 parts per million, or 21.6 specifically in the first row. We have no CYA in the water, and our average CT inactivation value is 10,500. That translates to a little over 8 hours of inactivation time. If we jump down to the third row in this table, our chlorine concentration is roughly 20 ppm at 19.1. We're now increasing the CYA concentration to 16 ppm or milligrams per liter, and our average estimated CT inactivation value jumps up to 31,500. This translates to 27.5 hours of inactivation time. So this is what it looks like when we're roughly around 20 parts per million free available chlorine. What happens if we increase to 40 parts per million, or milligrams per liter? So at 40, in the fourth column, or fourth row, excuse me, at 40.6 milligrams per liter free chlorine, average CYA concentration of 0, we have a CT inactivation value of 12,400. This would translate to about 5 hours, just over 5 hours of inactivation time. If we maintain our free chlorine at roughly 38.3, as we see in the last row, but increase our average CYA concentration to 15 parts per million, or milligrams per liter, our average estimated CT inactivation value jumps up to 19,400. And we're talking now about 8.4, almost 8.5 hours of inactivation time. So we're seeing the impact of, how we're increasing what we need to do to inactivate cryptosporidium because of the presence of CYA in the water. At 20 parts per million, we're going from 8.2 hours to 27.5 hours just by increasing the CYA concentration from 0 to 16. At 40 parts per million, we are going from 5 hours at 0 ppm cyanuric acid to 8.4 hours at 15 parts per million cyanuric acid. So the ramifications of cyanuric acid are definitely more pronounced when it comes to crypto versus the other infectious pathogens are inactivated much quicker. This slide here looks at cryptosporidium inactivation with cyanuric acid at 48 parts per million. And here again, the first column is the average chlorine concentration, milligrams per liter. Second column is the average CYA concentration at milligrams per liter. The third column is average estimated CT inactivation value. But keep in mind that in this slide, it's at 1 log, or 90% inactivation, and the pH again is 7.6 and the temperature is 25 degrees Celsius. The fourth column is the average inactivation time in hours. So if we look at the first row, if we're maintaining the chlorine concentration at 20 parts per million, roughly 21.6 specifically, and the CYA is at 0, our estimated CT inactivation value is 3,500, and it'll take 2.7 hours to inactivate 90, just 90% of the cryptosporidium. If we're maintaining the free chlorine at roughly 20 parts per million at 21.2, and we increase that CYA concentration from 0 to 48, that CT inactivation value jumps to 76,500, and we're now looking at 61.9 hours just to achieve 90% inactivation. The third and fourth row of the table look at what happens when our free chlorine concentration is around 40. So at 40.6 ppm free available chlorine, at 0 ppm CYA, we're looking at a CT inactivation value of 4,100 and about 1.7 hours to achieve just 90% inactivation. If we're maintaining that free available chlorine at around 40 parts per million at 38.5 and increasing the CYA concentration to 46 ppm, our average estimated CT inactivation value jumps to 40,000, and we're talking about 17.2 hours just to achieve 1 log inactivation. The basic take-home message for this slide is you're not going to achieve 3 log or 99.9% of inactivation, which is the goal in the MAC, in a reasonable time frame. So here, for example, within 24 hours, when your CYA concentration is approaching 50 ppm. When Jen started looking at CYA concentrations of 100 ppm, the data got even more discouraging to some extent. So you can achieve 0.8 log inactivation, or 84% reduction in crypto-oocyst inactivation with the chlorine concentration at 20 parts per million in 144 hours, or 6 days. You can also achieve 0.8 log reduction of cryptosporidium oocysts with the chlorine concentration of 40 milligrams per liter ppm in 24 hours. I mean, this is not really a usable option for the aquatics industry. When we're looking at 1.4 log reduction of cryptosporidium oocysts with chlorine concentration of 40 milligrams per liter ppm, we're talking about 72 hours. And there was, while Jen tried to achieve 1 log inactivation, she was unable to collect enough data to really calculate a CT value. So I guess that's more of a reflection of the kind of work that it takes to get this done. It's taking days. We're not even talking, you know, a few hours or a few minutes anymore. We're talking about days at this point, and this is just not a viable, you know, way of running a business, staying closed for so many days. So in response to diarrheal contamination events, based on the data we have, when there's CYA present, CDC's steps for closing the pool and removing the contamination are pretty, you know, standard and with the other contamination events. But now we're talking about, you know, remediating in different ways. With CYA being present, the options are lowering the CYA to 15 parts per million or less. This might mean draining and refilling the aquatic venue, and subsequently raising the chlorine level to 20 parts per million for 28 hours or more, or 30 parts per million for 18 hours or more, or 40 parts per million or more for 8.5 hours or more, or the equivalent. We're talking now about circulating the water through the secondary disinfection system to reduce the oocyst to 1 oocyst per 100 mLs, or another option could be to drain the aquatic venue entirely and refill it. Again, possibly not an option, especially in, you know, or sustainable option in drought-stricken areas. So when we're talking about hours and days of disinfecting, we're talking about using a lot of chlorine, a lot of pool chemicals. So I did want to take this opportunity to talk about, you know, pool chemical-associated health events or injuries. And just to keep in mind, you know, we estimate that there's anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 emergency department visits each year for pool chemical-associated injuries or health events. And when I'm talking about these events, I'm talking about respiratory distress, possibly from inhaling fumes, vapors, or gases, or, you know, a burn in the eye or in the skin because of splashes of chemicals. And this is honestly just the tip of the iceberg. This is who's going to the emergency room to seek care. There are people who are injured who never seek care or who are going to the healthcare provider, and these injuries are not captured by this surveillance system. Common themes we're seeing with these injuries, when we looked at 2012 data, you know, handling chemicals without using personal protective equipment, not using goggles, so therefore, you know, there's chemical burns in the eyes. Adding chemicals directly to the water just before the patient enters the water has been an issue. Multiple reports of injuries, frequently in the hotel-motel setting or residential setting. And there's also the issue of failing to secure chemicals away from children. It follows that contributing factors in all of this are really about human error and equipment failure. Our pool operators and residential pool owners really don't have the knowledge that they need about just basic pool chemical safety. And there's also the issue of, you know, standard pool equipment that's allowing for situations where, for example, concentrated chlorine and acid can mix and generate toxic chlorine gas. So what does the MAC have to say about chlorine safety? And really it's taken the approach of the 3 E's of pool chemical safety. It deals with preventing pool chemical-associated health events in terms of engineering, education, and enforcement. In terms of engineering, it recommends electrical interlocks between the chemical feed and recirculation systems. So if the chemical feed pump shut down and the water becomes stagnant in the recirculation plumbing, it's about making sure, if the recirculation pump shuts down, the water is stagnant, it's about shutting down the chemical feed pumps as well automatically, because you don't want concentrated chlorine and gas, you know, building up in the pipes and then toxic chlorine gas being generated and patients being affected. It's also about, designing and constructing these chemical storage spaces in a way that promotes chemical safety. In terms of education, it's about training staff that are responsible for storing chemical handling, and teaching them about pool chemical safety. In terms of operator training, it's making sure that operator training includes pool chemical safety. When we're talking about enforcement, it's about having designs or plan reviews that also look at chemical storage spaces. And on-site inspections, making sure chemicals are stored safely. And the link here at the bottom of the slide goes to the model MAC inspection form in case you all want to look there and see how the MAC addresses pool chemical safety and other health and safety issues at aquatic facilities in terms of inspections. And in terms of pool chemical safety, CDC's Healthy Swimming website has a page on preventing pool chemical safety at health events. It includes links to free posters that are available on pool chemical safety use and pool chemical safety storage, and each one is in both English and Spanish, and they're laminated thanks to the American Chemistry Council. Also the American Chemistry Council and the World Chlorine Institute put together a video on pool chemical safety available for free on YouTube in English, Spanish, and I believe other languages as well. And that's it for me, so I guess I'll turn it over to the rest of you if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And you are right, we are going to move on to our Q&A portion of the webinar. So I'll go ahead and read off a few that we had throughout the presentation. The first question is, how much of the increase that you've seen in GI illness is contributed to better data tracking?
I think there's something to be said for that. The increase you'll see in the cases, in the outbreaks in the late 90s is also when Michael Beach started working on healthy swimming and focus on collecting these data. And you'll see 2007 when there's a big jump or that big increase was also the year, Jonathan Yoder, myself started working on recreational water illnesses, and Virginia Roberts came in from the surveillance end, and started making contact. So I think some of it could be reporting artifact. I also think some of it could be the fact that I think the public is more aware that water can cause outbreaks as well. It's not about necessarily where I ate last night, but it could be where I've been swimming the last week. So I do think there is some of that. But I do think crypto still is a major player in all of this.
Great, thank you. The next question asks, does cyanuric acid matter with indoor pools and the quality of the water? Maybe we could get a little more, some clarity from the person who asked that question, if that's possible.
And I think this is Jason Kuntz from CDC as well. I'm helping NACCHO tag team the Q&A here. So as we're seeking clarity on that, we'll move on to the next. So why is it not recommended to use cyanuric acid with new/substantially altered hot tubs and therapy pools?
Well, with hot tub spas, it's hard enough to maintain your disinfectant concentration as it is. And so not using cyanuric acid puts you that much further ahead in being able to maintain the concentrations you need and want. You also notice when I went through the slides, they have a higher minimum, just so you have that extra, wiggle space when, patrons are using the hot tub and there's a potential drop. I don't know if Doug wants to add anything to that, or.
Again, I apologize. I've got a lot of technical difficulties here, so I'm not having a hard time following. I would have to say that right now we've got an ad hoc committee that's doing some tremendous amount of work on cyanuric acid and stabilizers. and they're in the process of developing a manuscript for submittal for publication. And once that's out, I think that's going to provide the foundation for future changes in the MAC with regards to cyanuric acid. And I think a lot of what's in there now could be, we could see a different way of looking at things once this report has been submitted and published. So I think there's more to follow. It was best available information for protecting public health when things went in. Again, the thought at the time was a slower kill rates in the presence of stabilizer, but a lot of that information wasn't actually verified or validated, and that's what this ad hoc committee is doing, is sorting out the fact from fiction and the actual chemistry and what's really going on. So again, a relook at things may be appropriate once the publication of this paper.
So we did have some clarity on the question about indoor pool use. Kathleen was asking what is the difference about an indoor pool, because there is an effect of the sunlight, the UV rays on the binding. So Lucy says that cyanuric acid should not be used indoors at all. There's no benefit, and it does reduce chlorine's effectiveness. So do you all concur with that, Michelle and Doug and Jason?
This Doug, again, I mean, that was the common thought and considerations, as it didn't provide benefit in an indoor setting because there's no UV rays, or minimal to protect it from. But I'd like to, wait till this paper is published and relook at things. But again, a lot of it was based on best information at the time, but we may look at it differently.
Great, thanks. So moving on to the next questions, I guess. In a pool using cyanuric acid that decides to drain and fill, is there a recommendation to still superchlorinate to 15,300 contact time? Oh, the hours, that's in minutes. There's a risk that now all water is drained from pipes, filters, and pool components.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the beginning.
The question is that if a pool drains, is there still a recommendation to superchlorinate?
So if the pool is completely drained?
Yes.
Well, if there was a diarrheal incident, that actually is an option, and yes, I mean, there'll be some water in the pipes, but you've diluted it so much. Remember, the goal is to decrease, to achieve 99.9% reduction in crypto, and going from a whole pool to just being left with what water's in the pipes, you're going to achieve that.
Okay, and I
but that's probably not a sustainable option for multiple jurisdictions, especially the drought, affected jurisdictions. But we do recommend, we do also provide that as an option for our smaller venues. For example, if there isn't formed fecal or diarrheal incident in our smaller venues where there's less water, for example, a hot tub spa or a water playground or interactive water play venue, I mean, draining might be the easier option when you think about how long it takes to disinfect, especially, with CYA and crypto.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I skipped past the question, so I'll return to that. My apologies. There was a question about when you're presenting your data about crypto inactivation under 48 parts per million. Is that data commercial facilities only or residential also?
So the MAC applies to public aquatic facilities. It does not really. It doesn't apply to backyard, or residential pools. And actually, we don't recommend hyperchlorination of residential pools. The risk of pool chemical associated health event is probably much greater than the risk of transmission of crypto.
Great. Next question is, do you believe that excessive cyanuric acid in swimming pool is a cause for shutting down a facility until that level is lowered?
Doug, were you able to pick up on that? This is Jason. I can repeat it for you. Yeah, no problem, Doug. I think Doug's probably the resident expert on that question right there. Doug, the question was, do you believe that excessive cyanuric acid in a swimming pool is cause for shutting down a facility until that cyanuric acid is lowered?
Well, again, we've got the limit going to what the MAC says. Our limit now is to 90 or 100 ppm. There's the issue of just toxicity, and World Health Organization recommendations is an upper level. And then there's also the concern, the potential concern of is it high enough levels that it's rendering the chlorine ineffective? And that's kind of the basis of those two concerns, and the basis of the upper limit. So at this stage, I think if it's in excess of what's currently published, which is not talking about crypto, but just your normal operation, your enteric pathogens, then I think it is appropriate to follow the protocols and lower that. Now, if we're looking at crypto and what the information Michele just presented, you can see the dilemma of you can't inactivate at those higher levels. So I think, again, to have proper sanitation, you've got to follow the parameters, and it would and is appropriate.
So moving on to the next question, can you comment on the 10 part per million chlorine level for bather entry in the MAC versus the levels mandated by FERFA? Excuse me.
This is Doug. I can comment on that. In the MAC, the EPA, and when the companies are submitting their product information, there's label restrictions that's based on what the product manufacturer is submitting as the operating parameters. What the MAC is looking at in the 10 ppm is that what was known about is there potential health effects just on chlorine at that level, and there's no indication that the chlorine would be a health concern at that level. The one issue that a lot of the folks that do testing of pool on water know that at higher levels of chlorine that it bleaches out particularly your DPD reagent. So it's on your colorimetric test kits, and then the titrometric, you cannot get an accurate reading. So that 10 ppm is a kind of a blend of those two, that you've got operational problems, not being able to identify what the actual residuals are, and the 10 ppm, there's no indication that you're going to have adverse health effects based on 10 ppm. But the FIFRA is based on, again, I think manufacturers' submission of information and their EPA registrations.
Awesome. There's been some really interesting conversation in our chat box as well. I haven't seen additional questions, but there has been conversation from Kathleen that she works at a children's institute, and there's just been discussion about using cyanuric acid indoors, and whether that is something that would be beneficial in that kind of setting or not. So thank you for having some stimulating conversation in the chat box, everyone, and for answering each other's questions. Does anyone else have additional questions they would like to ask? All right, well, yes. The presentation will be emailed out. The full recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in about a week, and it will also be uploaded to the MAC webpage on NACCHO's website, and you can find the links to that in the slides as well. So if you registered, you will receive that. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for participating. We're finishing just a couple minutes early here. On behalf of NACCHO and CDC, I'd like to thank Michele once more for joining us, and to everyone for sharing your experiences with the MAC. Again, if you'd like to receive information about our next webinar, be sure to register for the MAC network by sending your name and affiliation to MACnet, that's MAHCnet, @nacho.org. Thank you again for joining us for our webinar today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.